My entire brand is an homage to Steve Biko, and yet I don't talk about him enough around here. So today that's going to change as we commemorate what is the anniversary in 1977 of his assassination. Rest in power to Steve Biko. I am Biko Black. I mix what I like, what I like, what I like, what I like, what I like. What's up, world? Welcome back to I Mix What I Like right here at I Mix What I Like. Again, I'm Jared Ball. Very happy to be your host. Today in 1977, Steve Biko was assassinated, and just want to talk a little bit about him this morning because, again, an homage and a tribute to his work and his legacy, and in particular, his emancipatory journalism conducted in Azanian presses targeting Black and other oppressed communities with a form of Black consciousness that would encourage anti colonial struggle under the pseudonym Frank Talk in the pages of I Write What I Like. So here at I Mix What I Like, always meant to be the digital mixtape extension of that very same concept. Want to just talk a little bit about Biko this morning. So to do so, pulled up a couple articles, links in the show description, along with links to join the channel, like, share, subscribe. So do all of that as well. So in no particular order, just looked up a few articles to sort of reset the conversation, form the basis of a relatively short conversation about Biko. Starting here with Hood Communist. Shout out to their 5th anniversary. By Black consciousness, I mean the cultural and political revival of an oppressed people. This must be related to the emancipation of the entire continent of Africa since the Second World War. Africa has experienced the death of white invincibility. Before that, we were conscious mainly of two classes of people, the white conquerors and the Black conquered. The Blacks in Africa now know that the whites will not be conquerors forever. Steve Bantu Biko, I Write What I Like. First of all, I can't help but notice the immediate anti-Wakandan notion, the beautiful anti-Wakandan notion that this must be related to the emancipation of the entire continent of Africa. This is an article by Nicholas Mwangi, Black Consciousness and Steve Biko from September 2022. Mwangi starts off in his illustrious life as a Pan-African historian. Dr. John Henrik Clarke once remarked in the many lectures he delivered that some people are confused about where they belong among us. You can clarify this situation very easily. Your creator, the oppressor, has made no room in his house for you. You either belong among us or you don't belong in any place. Again, links in the show description. I encourage you to follow up with all of these articles on your own. I just want to glean a few pieces from them so we can just sort of stir up the Biko consciousness of Black consciousness. We can use revolutionary Pan-Africanism interchangeably with Black consciousness to combat neocolonialism and oppression. Steve Biko was fond of saying the most potent weapon in the hands of the oppressor is the mind of the oppressed. Thus, Black consciousness was not just a movement to fight apartheid. It was a philosophy found to make Africans change their mentality and free their minds from the ideas of inferiority and oppression. But how do you inculcate the philosophy of Black consciousness towards achieving an African revolution that is relentless and uncompromising? Only through political education and rigorous study can this be achieved. Avenues must be found to teach and self-educate. It is imperative for Pan-Africanist movements and social movements to embrace political education and study sessions, as the colonial sentiments show there is a lot to be done to undo mental slavery. We should start with the basis of what Brother Biko formulated in the early days of the Black consciousness movement in South Africa. I summarize his thoughts with the quotes from the book I Write What I Like, and in particular 2 chapters, Black Consciousness and the Quest for a True Humanity, and What is Black Consciousness. It is perhaps fitting to start by examining why it is necessary for us to think collectively about a problem we never created. In doing so, I do not wish to concern myself unnecessarily with the white people of South Africa, but to get to the right answers, we must ask the right questions. We have to find out what went wrong, where, and when. We have to find out whether our position is a deliberate creation of God or an artificial fabrication of truth by power-hungry people whose motive is authority, security, wealth, and comfort. In other words, the Black consciousness approach would be irrelevant in a colorless and non-exploitative egalitarian society. It is relevant here because we believe that an anomalous situation is a deliberate creation of man. Thus, a lot of attention has to be paid to our history if we as Blacks want to aid each other in our coming into consciousness. We have to rewrite our history and produce in it the heroes that form the core of our resistance to the white invaders. More has to be revealed, and stress has to be laid on the successful nation building attempts of men such as Shaka, Moshushu, and Hinsa. These areas call for intense research to provide some sorely needed missing links. We would be too naive to expect our conquerors to write unbiased histories about us, but we have to destroy the myth that our history starts in 1652, the year that Van Riebeck landed at the Cape. Steve Biko, I write what I like. By the way, as it applies obviously in Black America, our history didn't start at 1492 or 1619 or 1776 or 1964. Black consciousness refers to the Black man and to his situation. And I think the Black man is subjected to two forces in this country. He is, first of all, oppressed by an external world through institutionalized machinery, through laws that restrict him from doing certain things, through heavy work conditions, through poor pay, through very difficult living conditions, through poor education. These are all external to him. Secondly, and secondly, and this we regard as the most important, the Black man in himself has developed a certain state of alienation. He rejects himself precisely because he attaches the meaning white to all that is good. In other words, he associates good and he equates good with white. This arises out of his living and arises out of his development from childhood. And from this article by Joel Modiri in CLT, our favorite CRT, Steve Biko, we get a little bit more. Biko develops Black consciousness as a theory in politics of Black liberation composed principally of three acts. One, Black people's social awareness of the foundational anti-Blackness of the modern world. Two, a psychological recognition and situating oneself as proudly Black. And three, re-symbolization of Blackness as a building block towards the annulment of the anti-Black world and the creation of a new social reality, a true humanity, informed by the history, experience, and worldview of African peoples here and in diaspora. And as this article writes, Biko connected his anti-apartheid Black consciousness struggle to an anti-colonial struggle, more broadly speaking. And this is something that's obviously still needs to be considered today, as there still remains a tendency to encourage people to narrow their struggles to their particular instances in time and space. And obviously, it's it's a much larger problem than that. Now, from this piece here, a book called States and the Making of Others, Perspectives on Social State Institutions and Othering in Southern Africa and Western Europe. I wasn't able to get the entire chapter to read, but I found that just in looking around from June of this year, not white enough, not Biko, not white enough, not Biko black enough. The othering of colored identity in Southern and South African history in the South African history classroom. And as I said at the beginning, I noted that I am Biko black, and I got that from here. Something that I thought was very interesting, just from the abstract. In post-apartheid South Africa, history education was hailed as constructing a new national narrative that foregrounded racial justice and human rights. Absent from it, however, was any mention of the colored community, a racial group who claimed ancestry from various populations inhabiting the region. Instead, motivated by racialized unity and drawing from conceptualizations developed by the Black consciousness movement, colored people were considered Biko black, a term used to refer to all formerly disenfranchised groups. Drawing on 10 months of classroom ethnography in Cape Town, this chapter explores how grade 9 students who racialize themselves as colored are othered by the absence of a distinctive colored history in their curricula. It suggests the inability to identify themselves in the curricula means that they fail to recognize the important contribution that colored people made to the anti-apartheid struggle, a struggle that their teachers and textbooks present as Black versus white. Crucially, this form of othering is not undertaken to discriminate, but intended by teachers and textbook authors to foster a collective sense of Black identity and pride. This research thus uncovers subtle processes in which history teaching and racial politics combine to other in ways that prove socially destructive. Fascinating. I would definitely be interested in following up on that at some point, and including this concept of Biko Black that I think needs to be adopted and amended for the 21st century, even here in the United States, where shifting sands of one drop rules and biraciality, multiraciality, complexion, etc., are obviously still at play, and yet there's still a need for a black consciousness and an anti-colonial struggle. So if it helps, maybe we can dive into that at some point and revive this concept or expand the concept of being Biko Black. And a little bit more here from this month, just a few days ago in the conversation. Steve Biko's murder exposed deep racism and how medicine was taught and practiced in South Africa. And this is fascinating because for those who are familiar with the story, and even if you watched the or read the Donald Woods based biography, Cry Freedom, we remember that, or as I continue to note, this is what allowed Denzel Washington to have twice now played heroes of mine in films that are just, as Skip Coon says, diabolical in their presentation of the history. And in Cry Freedom, it seemed, if I remember correctly, I'm happy to be checked on this, but what I remember, it felt more like a biography of the Woods family, the White Woods family, and their heroic escape from South Africa, and Biko becomes this background figure. But one of the incidents that stands out, even from the film, that obviously was a major issue in at the end of Biko's life, was his torture in prison, and then his nearly 700-mile, I believe, transportation from the prison to the hospital, I believe in Pretoria, where he somehow survived that trip, but then died later in the hospital today in 1977. And there's been a lot of controversy over the years about the medical community's role in this and covering it up. And it apparently is ongoing. In 1966, Steve Biko began studying medicine at the University of Natal in South Africa, the same year that the General Assembly of the United Nations declared apartheid a crime against humanity. In his book, I write what I like, which has served as a guide for future generations of activists. He wrote, "The most potent weapon in the hands of the oppressor is the mind of the oppressed." Biko also became a powerful symbol of resistance as a result of his death in detention at the hands of the apartheid security police on 12 September 1977. 2 days earlier, healthy and 30 years old, he had been arrested in a city on South Africa's southeast coast, Port Elizabeth, now called Gqeberha. Forgive me for mispronouncing that. Biko died following savage beatings by the security police. The cause of death and the circumstances were repressed by the South African government. However, as more evidence began to emerge about the circumstances of his death, it became clear that the medical profession was heavily implicated. Two doctors had been asked to examine him after his beatings, and neither acted to have his wounds treated. The security police drove Biko over 700 kilometers across the country to Pretoria, where the security police had its headquarters. Biko made the trip naked in the back of a van, where he was injured further. He died the next night, alone in a hospital. So, as this article and subsequent ones will make the comparison to George Floyd, this also harkens back for some of us to the Freddie Gray van ride of death, and the continuity of this legacy of police abuse and colonial repression. It was the South African Medical and Dental Council's role to protect patients from improper medical conduct, but the council did not hold the doctors accountable. Instead, it did everything it could to try to cover up the negligence and complicity of the two doctors. In the late 1800s, in the first half of the 20th century, the concepts of comparative anatomy, race typology, and a hierarchy of race flourished among scientists, physical anthropologists, anatomists, and doctors in Europe, Britain, and the US and South Africa. As a result, scientists promoted disturbing anthropological practices, including the unethical collection of human skeletons, again, i.e., the MOVE movement in Pennsylvania, Philadelphia, and measuring physical characteristics without consent. These collections, originally gathered to prove the inequality of races, continue to be held locally and internationally. So again, there's obviously a lot more to that issue and that case. The links in the show description again, if folks want to follow up. But with that one and this next story, there's still some revisitation on the cause of death and then the cover up of Biko's death. The death of Steve Biko. This is in JSTOR Daily. The death of Steve Biko revisited. Like the death of George Floyd, the South African activist Steve Biko's death galvanized a global movement against racism. Steve Biko, one of the most prominent leaders in the anti-apartheid struggle, died in police detention on September 12, 1977. He was imprisoned on charges of terrorism. The South African Minister of Police announced that he died after a 7-day hunger strike. Riots ensued in the aftermath of this statement, and a few students were killed in the protests. 15,000 people showed up to Biko's funeral, including foreign dignitaries, African diplomats, and about 13 Western diplomats. The governments of Ghana and Lesotho released official statements of outrage. The South African police had clearly underestimated the potential consequences of his death, and a global movement emerged demanding justice for Biko. A core feature of many Black radical experiences, we find that, as this article recounts, that Biko's early rise into activism involved his work with the South African Student Association, but he quickly ran afoul of what he called the white liberal paternalism that, as the article says here, could not justify the demands of non-whites, and that blacks should organize on their own. Black man, you are on your own was the slogan of his Black consciousness movement, which advocated self-awareness and self-reliance for Black people. The article says here that Biko was no African nationalist. He redefined Black in a time of incredible disunity in the African movement. The African National Congress and the Pan-Africanist Congress had been banned by the South African police in the aftermath of the Sharpeville massacre of 1960. The African Students Association and the African Students Union of South Africa were dividing along sectional, tribal, and ideological lines. SASO was not a movement for Africans, not a movement for Indians, for colored people. Biko famously said it was a movement for people who are oppressed. To be Black meant to be oppressed. And like the death of George Floyd, Biko's death galvanized a global movement against racism. His extrajudicial killing embarrassed apartheid South Africa on the global stage, much the way Floyd's death has embarrassed the United States. Although Biko was an activist and George Floyd a citizen, in one crucial way, their deaths were quite similar. Two Black people whose deaths were contested at the point of inquest and autopsy. Yeah, I wonder to what extent the United States is actually embarrassed by that, but point well taken. Autopsies carried out by law enforcement have long been the site of political contestation. They have a heavy weight in the courtroom and can provide a narrative that either condemns the state or absolves it. For this very same reason, in the aftermath of Steve Biko's death, doctors debated passionately in the British Medical Journal about how he died and what role of the white South African doctors was and what the role of white South African doctors was in the process. British doctors condemned the South African Medical Association. The South African doctors retorted in defensiveness. Dr. Ivor Lang later admitted that he wrote out a highly incorrect medical certificate at the request of Colonel Goosen of the security police. Most readers will have been horrified by reports of the inquest on Steve Biko, wrote R. Hoffenberg, a doctor working in Queen Elizabeth Hospital in Birmingham, England in 1978, where he reported that Dr. Ivor Lang later admitted that he wrote out a highly incorrect medical certificate at the request of Colonel Goosen of the security police. An inquest later revealed that Biko died from traumatic brain injury, not a hunger strike, as announced by the South African Minister of Police. In 1978, despite allegations by Lang and Tucker that they were acting on instructions of the police, the state found no such evidence and recommended to the medical council that no further action be taken against the doctors. In 1991, at the end of apartheid, the British Medical Journal headlined a story on the Confessions of South African Medical Journal, declaring openly that it tried to cover up protests by dissident doctors in South Africa who submitted to their journal. In 1997, the South African Truth and Reconciliation Commission provided amnesty to the 5 officers who tortured Biko and left him with the doctors who covered their tracks. Their names were Harold Sinman, Gideon Nieuwhout, R. Marks, J. Bank, and Dandinji Siebert. Amnesty. Yeah, that's the frustrating part about. So I remember, again, when I was in the Africana Studies and Research Center under the leadership of the late, great Dr. James Turner, Desmond Tutu came to Cornell to speak, and as most Black luminaries do or did when they went to Cornell to give a major speech or whatever they were doing there, they would often come and give a private audience to the Africana Studies and Research Center. And I was in the room, packed classroom, where Tutu gave a small talk and where an Azanian brother from the back stood up and fighting back the tears and struggling to get his words out, made the point basically that while Tutu was going around parading the and praising the post-apartheid corrections and evolution, and was seeking support and funding from institutions like Cornell. uh, this brother was saying that people in the townships were as bad then as they had been under apartheid, if not worse, and that little had been done to actually help the actual conditions of the people themselves. And it was raised as a challenge as to Tutu's support for the Reconciliation Commission, for suggesting an advance. And it was in his response, as he had said in his own book, that is Tutu's book, I guess one of his memoirs that had come out sometime around the late 90s, early 2000s, because I had read it before he showed up there, if I remember correctly. Or did I read it after he left? Anyway, the sentiment was the same in this space as in the book. And his point was, Tutu said, you can he was asked specifically, why are you supporting Truth and Reconciliation when, as opposed to a Nuremberg set of trials for the Nazis after the Second World War, which seems far more analogous and appropriate. And his response was, we didn't win. I thought it was the most honest answer, even in his more liberalizing political position. It was a very honest answer. We didn't win. And the Reconciliation Commission was a compromise for having not actually won their liberation struggle. I just thought it was it's still to this day a very important admission of his part and point to focus on, that this is not a post victory reconciliation. It's a stalemate that allows for the white ruling elite to get off largely free and to keep control of the military and the economics and the resources of the country. All right, one last piece here, something I also have not had a chance to actually read, but I found and thought would look very interesting, and encourage people to check this out and let us know. Black X, Liberatory Thought in Azania. And I thought it was interesting, as I just happened to note, that it starts with a quote. Well, one of the epigraph quotes is from Frank Wilderson. This place won't be here in the morning, from his memoir, his incognito memoir of exile and apartheid, which I highly recommend that people read, especially if they want to resituate their approach to Afro pessimism, because I think this was my entrance into Frank's work. And the idea that he would be advocating disengagement from struggle and solidarity with oppressed groups is bizarre. It doesn't comport with, but nevertheless, an apparent point being made in this book that I definitely appreciate, from Tendai Sitole. If I'm saying that name correctly, please forgive me for that. I've read a number of this author's work and have never properly, I think, gotten the name correct. So I apologize for that. It's not at all. It's just my anglicized ignorance. I definitely want to get this book and read it in its entirety, but I really like what is presented here in these initial pages. Azania should be thought again and against the grain of enclosure and its attendant sterility, so that there is liberation even at this moment that is coined as the aftermath of apartheid, which is to say the post 1994 South Africa. The name of the country is one of the scandalous issues that still persists. Not that this is a boiling contention, but this is a fundamental issue that refuses any form of forgetting. Since this aftermath is that of forgetting, the work of remembering is done by those who not only still yearn for the renaming of South Africa, but insist on exposing its racist machinations and do not believe in the myth that it is a non-racial polity which has surpassed settler colonialism. I mean, I think everybody knows where I'm going with this. That is,
now listen, that's called my boy. You know nothing about that.
so I didn't go too far with that, but just that initial take is something I'm very much interested in, because as I was alluding to in that previous point, so much of what we're being told about post-apartheid South Africa, post-civil rights, post-Obama, post-racial America is mythological and masking, as was said there, the underpinnings of racism and settler colonialism. So I just wanted to do a quick commemorative shout to Steve Biko on this, the anniversary of his assassination in 1977, and to encourage that we pick up a lot of what he left for us in terms of, again, this approach to anti-colonial, anti-settler colonial Black consciousness, that we continue to engage as he encouraged whatever spaces we enter, media or otherwise, as spaces of struggle over advocating and encouraging a radical Black consciousness. And that for those of us on the margins of Blackness, that we happily hypo-descend into being Biko Black. Big shout out to Steve Biko. Big shout out to all anti-colonial freedom fighters. As he would have continued to encourage and write what he likes, we will continue here to mix what we like. And as always, as Fred Hampton used to say, peace only if you're willing to fight for it. And we'll catch you next time right here at
I mix what I like, what I like, what I like, what I like, what I like.